Imagine it's November. The last harvest has been gathered. The root cellar is packed. The snow has come early, and it isn't leaving until April. You have no supermarket, no delivery app, no refrigerator humming in the corner. Just a family, a fireplace, and whatever you managed to pull from the earth before the ground froze solid. For pioneer families crossing the American frontier, the Canadian wilderness, or the remote Scottish Highlands, this wasn't a thought experiment. This was life. And if they got their food preservation wrong, they didn't make it to spring. Today, we're going inside the winter pantry of our ancestors. 10 techniques, tested by centuries, forgotten by modernity. And honestly, some of them are so clever, they'll make you question everything you know about keeping food fresh. Let's get into it. 1. The salt box, drawing out death itself. Salt is the oldest food preservative known to man, and pioneer families knew exactly why. When you pack meat in salt, something almost alchemical happens. The salt draws moisture out of the food through a process called osmosis. Without moisture, bacteria can't survive. Without bacteria, decay stops in its tracks. The meat essentially enters a kind of stasis, preserved in time like a biological amber. Pioneer families would layer cuts of pork, venison, or beef into barrels, alternating meat and coarse salt, then seal the barrel and leave it in the coldest corner of the cellar. A properly salted barrel of pork could last an entire winter, sometimes two. They called it putting down the salt, and that phrase carried the weight it deserved. Getting it wrong meant the barrel would rot. Getting it right meant your children ate through February. The craft was in the ratio, roughly 1 pound of salt per 5 pounds of meat, and in making sure every surface of flesh was covered. Even a small exposed patch could become a doorway for spoilage. 2. Smoking. Flavor as a fortress. You've tasted smoked salmon, smoked bacon, smoked cheese, but you've probably never thought about why smoking food actually works on a molecular level. When pioneer families hung their meat above a slow, smoldering fire, typically burning hardwoods like hickory, apple, or oak, the smoke wasn't just adding flavor. It was depositing compounds called phenols and aldehydes onto the surface of the food. These compounds are deeply antimicrobial. They form a literal chemical barrier against bacterial growth. Combined with the heat drying out moisture, smoking created a double-layered preservation. The outside of the meat would become almost leathery, a hardened casing that protected the softer flesh within. Smokehouses were serious infrastructure on a pioneer homestead, not a weekend barbecue setup. A dedicated wooden building, carefully managed with specific wood types chosen for both their burn rate and their antimicrobial properties. A well-smoked ham hung in a cool, dry space could last 6 months or more. That wasn't luxury. That was the entire family's winter protein supply hanging from a rafter. 3. Root cellaring, using the earth as a refrigerator. Here's something remarkable. The earth itself maintains a near-constant temperature of around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly 10 to 13 degrees Celsius, just a few feet below the surface, year-round, no energy required. Pioneer families built root cellars by digging directly into the ground or into a hillside, lining the walls with stone, and covering the entrance with heavy wooden doors insulated with straw or earth. The result was a natural refrigerator, cool, dark, and humid enough to keep vegetables like carrots, turnips, beets, potatoes, and cabbages fresh for months. What makes a root cellar work isn't just the cold. It's the combination of cold, darkness, and controlled humidity. Too dry and vegetables shrivel. Too warm and they rot. The earth naturally regulates all three. Some families would bury their root vegetables directly in sand or sawdust to further slow moisture loss. Others packed apples in barrels layered with straw, the straw absorbing any moisture while the cool temperature slowed the ripening process to a crawl. Root cellars weren't just storage, they were engineering. Understanding which vegetables stored well together, which ones released gases that spoiled others, how to manage airflow. All of it was handed down through generations as essential knowledge. 4. Lard sealing, burying food in fat. This one sounds alarming by modern standards, but stay with it, because it's genuinely brilliant. When pioneer families rendered pork fat into lard, they didn't just use it for cooking, they used it as a preservation medium. Cooked cuts of meat, particularly pork, would be submerged entirely beneath a thick layer of rendered lard and sealed in earthenware crocks. The fat acted as an airtight seal. No oxygen could reach the meat. And without oxygen, the aerobic bacteria that cause spoilage simply could not function. The French still practice a version of this today. They call it confit. But for pioneer families, it wasn't a culinary technique. It was survival. Kept in a cool cellar, lard-sealed meat could last 3 to 4 months without any deterioration. The fat itself would also be reused, melted, strained, and poured back over fresh batches as the season went on. Nothing wasted, everything purposeful. 5. Drying and jerking, removing the ingredient bacteria need most. Bacteria need 3 things to survive: warmth, nutrients, and moisture. Pioneer families couldn't always control warmth. They couldn't remove nutrients from food, but moisture that they could absolutely eliminate. Drying meat, cutting it into thin strips and exposing it to either sun, wind, or gentle heat until virtually all moisture evaporated, was practiced by virtually every indigenous and pioneer culture across North America. The result was jerky, dense, dark, almost impossibly concentrated protein that weighed almost nothing and lasted almost indefinitely. The technique was adopted by European settlers directly from Native American communities, who had refined it across centuries. Different cultures used different seasonings: salt, pepper, juniper berries, even cedar smoke, but the underlying science was identical. No moisture, no decay. Dried fish was equally important, particularly in coastal and northern regions. Cod, halibut, and salmon would be split, salted lightly, and hung to dry until they became almost board stiff. A single dried fish could provide a family's protein for an entire day on the trail, and a barrel of them could sustain a homestead through weeks of snowbound isolation. 6. Fermenting, letting controlled rot save you from deadly rot. This might be the most counterintuitive trick on this list. To preserve food, pioneer families deliberately let it rot, just in a very specific, controlled way. Fermentation works because certain beneficial bacteria, particularly lactobacillus strains, produce lactic acid as they consume sugars. That acid rapidly drops the pH of the food, creating an environment so acidic that harmful, dangerous bacteria simply cannot survive. Sauerkraut, made from shredded cabbage packed in salt, was an absolute staple of German, Scandinavian, and Eastern European pioneer communities. Not because it tasted good, though they'd argue it does, but because a crock of sauerkraut could provide vegetables through an entire winter when nothing fresh was available. And crucially, it provided vitamin C, which prevented scurvy, a disease that killed more pioneers than most people realize. Fermented dairy, buttermilk, aged cheese, cultured butter served the same function. Even fermented grain mash was consumed in lean times, both for its caloric density and its relative safety compared to untreated water. The art of knowing which fermentation to encourage and which signs indicated something had gone dangerously wrong was critical knowledge. The difference between a life-saving crock and a deadly one. 7. Potting and sealing with wax, locking out the air. Before rubber seals and mason jar lids, pioneer families used beeswax and occasionally tallow to create airtight seals over crocks and pottery containers, storing everything from clarified butter to cooked meats and fruit preserves. The logic was simple. Air carries microbial contamination. seal the air out, and the food inside is protected. Clarified butter, also known as ghee in South Asian cooking traditions, was poured hot into pottery, allowed to cool and solidify, and then topped with a layer of molten beeswax. The fat itself resisted bacterial growth, and the wax seal ensured nothing from the outside could get in. Butter stored this way could last 6 months to a year in a cool cellar. Fruit preserves, jams and jellies made with enormous quantities of sugar used the same wax sealing approach. The high sugar content itself acted as a preservative by drawing moisture away from any bacterial cells, while the wax seal maintained the anaerobic environment inside the pot. It's a simple technique, and it worked with remarkable reliability. Vinegar is essentially weaponized acid, and pioneer families knew exactly how to use it. 8. Pickling. Acid as armor. Pickling, submerging vegetables, eggs, or even some meats in a vinegar-based brine, drops the pH of the food so sharply that harmful bacteria cannot survive. The acetic acid in vinegar is lethal to most foodborne pathogens at concentrations above about 4%. Most homemade Pioneer vinegar ran considerably stronger than that. Cucumbers, onions, green beans, cabbage, beets, and even hard-boiled eggs were pickled in late summer and early autumn, when the harvest was abundant and vinegar, typically made from apple cider or fermented grains, was plentiful. The pickled goods would then line the cellar shelves in whatever containers the family had: earthenware crocks, wooden barrels, repurposed bottles sealed with wax or cork. A well-stocked pickle shelf wasn't just food variety, it was insurance. When the salted meat was running low and the root vegetables had shrunk and softened beyond eating, the pickle crocks still had months of life left in them. 9. Burying in the ground, the forgotten art of earth storage. Beyond the formal root cellar, pioneer families used a simpler, older technique when time or resources didn't allow for full construction. They buried food directly in the ground. Root vegetables, particularly carrots, parsnips, and turnips, could be packed into straw-lined pits dug below the frost line and covered with boards, soil, and additional straw insulation. The Earth's natural temperature regulation kept them cool without freezing, and the straw prevented moisture condensation from encouraging rot. Whole cabbages were sometimes buried root up in straw-filled trenches, a method that, if done correctly, could preserve them well into January or February. In northern regions, some families used the opposite extreme: deliberate freezing. Meat and fish would be packed in barrels, set outside, and allowed to freeze solid in the first hard frost. Kept frozen, they would remain safe until the spring thaw, at which point the family knew it was time to eat or lose what remained. It was a delicate gamble in regions with unpredictable winters. A midwinter thaw could ruin an entire season's stored meat. But in reliably cold climates, the winter itself became the preservation system. 10. Sugar packing and honey sealing. Nature's preservatives. Honey is extraordinary. Archaeologists have found 3,000-year-old honey in Egyptian tombs, still perfectly edible. And pioneer families understood, even without the science, that honey and sugar had almost magical preservation properties. The reason comes down to water activity. Both honey and high concentrations of sugar contain almost no free water molecules. When a food is submerged in honey or packed in sugar, the osmotic gradient draws moisture out of any bacterial cells present, effectively dehydrating and killing them. Fruits packed in dry sugar, layered alternately with sugar in sealed crocks, would keep for months without fermentation or decay. The fruit would slowly candy over time, becoming intensely sweet and almost jewel-like, but completely safe and extraordinarily calorie-dense. For a family burning thousands of calories a day in winter cold and hard physical labor, that caloric density was as important as the safety. Honey was used to seal cooked meats in some traditions, particularly game birds. Fruit was submerged in raw honey and stored in sealed pots, emerging in midwinter as a preserved delicacy that would seem almost impossibly extravagant given the conditions outside. Sugar and honey weren't cheap or easy to come by for most pioneer families. But when they had them, they used them wisely, understanding intuitively that sweetness in the right quantities meant survival. There's a strange kind of humility that comes from studying how our ancestors fed themselves. We've been sold the idea that food preservation is a modern achievement, that refrigeration and vacuum sealing and food-grade plastics represent the pinnacle of what's possible. But look at what these families accomplished with salt, smoke, earth, fat, vinegar, and time. They fed themselves through months of brutal cold. They prevented scurvy. They avoided botulism mostly through accumulated generational knowledge. They made the most of every animal, every harvest, every drop of rendered fat. None of these tricks required electricity. None of them required a supply chain. Some of them required almost nothing except patience, attention, and the knowledge passed down from the generation before. We lost most of that knowledge in about 50 years. Refrigerators arrived in common households through the 1920s and 30s, and within a generation, almost everything covered in this video had been forgotten, filed away as primitive and unnecessary. But it wasn't primitive. It was ingenious. And in a world where supply chains have proven fragile, where energy prices rise and fall unpredictably, where people are increasingly asking where their food comes from, these techniques are having a quiet, deserved revival. The pioneers didn't just survive winter, they understood it. They prepared for it with discipline, skill, and hard-won knowledge. Maybe it's time we remembered a little of that. If this video gave you something to think about, consider subscribing. We go deep into forgotten history, traditional skills, and the stories of the people who built the world we inherited. Leave a comment below. Which of these techniques surprised you most? We read every single one. Until next time, stay curious.